Hello, and welcome back to the Author Roundup, a special segment of the Book Connection Show where we meet up and coming indie authors and talk to them about their recently released books. Hi, this is Ray Walters. Now, in this episode, I will be talking to the author of the book Pacific LST. Our guest was an associate director for a family medicine residency program at the University of North Dakota for 20 years before retiring. He has published numerous papers in medical publications and is an amateur historian and a strong interest in World War II. Viewers and listeners, in today's episode, our guest, Stephen Stride. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
Congratulations. You just had your book published with iUniverse.
Yes, sir.
It was 6 months ago, and I hope everything's doing well.
Everything is going fine. Yes.
All right. So, Stephen, you published the book entitled Pacific LST. But before we're going to talk about the book first, I know our viewers and listeners would want to go ahead and know you a little bit more. So can you tell us a little bit about your background?
I'm a family physician. I've been a family physician for over 40 years. The first 20 years were spent in solo practice in Humboldt, Nebraska, a small town of about 1,300 in southeast Nebraska. I'm sort of a dinosaur because I also did a lot of surgery myself. And then about halfway through, I got the hospital closed because there were a lot of small town hospitals closing. So I migrated up to Minot, North Dakota, and became associate professor of family medicine at the University of North Dakota in Minot and taught at a residency program. So
yeah, that's you. Are you still a physician, or you've retired?
I've retired. I'm kind of happy to be just kind of not have to be under the pressure anymore.
Right, must be a major breather for you. But you're already a writer. Your introduction says you've published numerous medical publications before. So writing is something that you're already doing as a doctor.
Yes, I've published several papers, research papers that I've done. I've also published a couple opinion things in different medical journals. And I've also have published one more book called The Journey to Paradise, which is actually a short novel many years ago.
That's very interesting. Stephen, it also says here that you have a strong interest in World War II, the history. You're an amateur. You call yourself an amateur historian, but sometimes, whenever people say they're amateur, they're actually really good at what they do. So, amateur historian who has a love for World War II stuff. You're a family physician, and I'd probably be expecting you to write a book about, it could probably be a medical drama, could be a medical crime thing like Pathology, the movie. So, but why this book right now that you've published?
Pacific LST is basically about my father's ship during World War II. He was in the Coast Guard and sailed on this ship, an LST. LST refers to landing ship tank, and it would put Marines aboard ashore, or up to 20 Sherman tanks could be landed directly on the shore. And he was at the invasion. This ship was at the invasion of Okinawa. So he never talked about it. So I needed to investigate and find out what went on. I thought, well, I might as well put it into a book because it's kind of interesting.
I see. So this Pacific LST is a novel, right?
Not really a novel, no. It's more of like a history book in a way, because it goes through what this ship went through, father went through, the things that happened around Okinawa. Then I also have included other things that happened at Okinawa. Everybody talks about the land battle, but there isn't too much about the sea battle or about the landing ships or the amphibious ships, what they were doing.
Right. So the inspiration for your book is based off of your father's experience as a soldier.
Yeah, he was a seaman first class is what he was. Yeah. So that's why I wrote the book. And as I was doing research, I found other little stories to put into the book, which I thought were interesting and of some note to take. So you'll find some things in there about like the journalist Ernie Pyle. You'll find some stuff about the hospital ship USS Comfort, talk about the kamikaze attacks at Okinawa and the landing of the Marines that they put on the beach at Okinawa.
Let me ask you this question. Which one's harder to write? Medical publications or this book you have just published?
Good question. Medical papers usually you have to have it backed up by facts, and then it goes through a review thing by other medical doctors to see if it's worth publishing. The Pacific LST is basically historical documentation. I didn't have to put it through any historians, although I did have an historian emeritus from Minot State go through it and check to make sure that everything I said was correct and if there was any corrections, but that was it.
Right. So you did research. Research is still needed, and it's giving me an idea that it is equally as tough. So how long did it take you to complete your work?
Well, the part I'm talking about, the Pacific LST, is the second book or a revision of the first. And probably took 10 years for me to get it all done. It started back in 2003 when I was curious about my father's ship, and there was some of his crewmates were still having reunions in Mobile, Alabama, and I asked them if I could join. They said sure. So I picked up my mother and we went down. At that time, they just brought back the LST 325 from Greece and got a tour of it. And then we had a fun time talking, but I also took a tape recorder and recorded their stories. And those stories are in the book.
Right. That's going to be interesting to read. So what did you feel when you were going through memory lane? Did you feel like you got to know your father better, or there were other things that you didn't get firsthand, or information about your father that you didn't get firsthand from him? Because that's kind of like interesting to also hear people talk about other people and like know someone through their perspective. So how did you feel when you were going through it, the entire process?
It gave me a view of the, to use a cliche, trials and tribulations that these men went on during wartime, particularly at the last great seaborne invasion of World War II, which was Okinawa.
Right.
And I got to know things I didn't know. For my father never talked very much about it. You know, most of the veterans that came back from war, and even you'll see this in Vietnam veterans and stuff, they don't really talk about the combat or anything much. They just don't do it. And so I learned stuff that he saw, which I thought gave me more respect and love for him than I ever had. My father usually talked about, you know, being on the ship and at sea, says we just, you know, scrape and paint because steel ships in a salty environment rust a lot. So they had a lot of scraping to get the rust off and paint the ship. And he would tell stories of like the LST was slow. You know, in fact, the sailors sometimes would say LST meant large, slow target. So he told the story about a destroyer that went past him and the sailors from the destroyer yelling over to him, "Hey, quit dragging your anchor." So, you know, those are things I heard, but I never heard anything about the combat or anything.
Let me see that. Okay. Since we're talking about your feelings while you were writing it, what was the most fun part in the writing process of your book?
The most fun part was actually going back through the other references, you know, the other published stories and about the different men or units that were involved in the war. I got a bunch of other material, I sent away to the National Archive and got the deck logs of the ship and the action reports. So I was able to incorporate those. So I learned a lot more about that.
It's
from
still
that.
learning.
Yeah, so between that and the stories that I recorded from his shipmates,
Mhm.
I was able to write the book, put it together.
What's the most difficult part?
Yeah, how to start, I guess. Where do you start telling a story like this? So I started from the very beginning when after Pearl Harbor and the things that went on at that time. So that included my mother and him and just interesting things that occurred during that time.
Did you come across like stories that you had a hard time while you were doing a research that you were having a hard time absorbing?
There were some things like some maneuvers that the ship did or the captain did that I didn't quite understand what they were doing or why they were doing. So I had to do a little bit more digging into the history of the LST and what they were used for. And then, oh, that's why they did that. That kind of feeling of it came to me.
Right.
And then trying to figure out a way to put it down in words so the reader can understand it.
Most of our viewers and listeners, Stephen, are authors.
Mhm.
So what advice can you give them? How do you start a the story of your book, or how do you start your work? Do you just basically write down anything that comes into your mind, or do you create a layout, or what advice can you give them?
Well, this type of book, what I did was started out basically discussing how the U.S. Coast Guard was involved in World War II and the men and women that served in the Coast Guard, and the fact that a lot of the ships, particularly amphibious ships, were Coast Guard men, manned entirely by Coast Guardmen. Also, I didn't know, but it's true, is the Coast Guard in wartime comes under naval authority. So the Navy actually has authority over the Coast Guard at that time. So I went through there. Then I kind of went into the background of the LST itself, some specifics, minutia type stuff, how long it was, how many wide, what kind of engines, and the armaments of the LST and the different variations that occurred. That is a background. So once you know that, then you can go into the specifics of, I went into the specifics of my father's ship.
Right. So basically the book revolves around your dad's perspective. Am I correct?
Well, two perspectives, actually, sort of a narrator or a third person
Okay.
outside. But an interesting thing is, like I said, the first edition of the copy I published, and I had people would call me that were either children or grandchildren of shipmates of my father, so I would get to know them. The last one, the reason, I guess, the impetus for this book is I had a gentleman contact me who was the son-in-law of the captain of the ship.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
And he sent me, the captain wrote some memoirs of his time in the Coast Guard during World War II. And I thought, well, that might be good to put into the book as added, that's more material from a viewpoint of the skipper, what he saw on things. So I got permission from his wife and his wife's sister, who are daughters of the captain, to do that. So I went through and integrated those memoirs in with the first book and did some modifications based on that and editing. And that's how the second book, or the revision of the first, came out. And I think it makes it better because you get more of a broad spectrum of, my dad was a seaman, he was a crewman. The
Yeah.
skipper, he ran the ship, and some of the things that they had to talk about. So, and one final thing that was fun, the skipper kept home movies of the ship when they were on ship. He didn't
Wow.
record any combat scenes, but he had movies that showed scenes of the convoy going to Okinawa and pictures of other crewmen And I think I recognized my dad in that film,
Wow.
a skinny 20-year-old seaman.
Must have been a nice feeling for you to have seen your dad in those footages. What's the nicest feedback that you received from having this book published?
I've been told it's accurate. It's fun to read. It's enjoyable. People learn things that they didn't know about the Coast Guard, about the amphibious Navy, particularly LSTs, or Okinawa, what actually happened there. Like I said, what I've always said is there's a lot of movies and stuff like Pacific that came out talking about the Marines on Okinawa, but nobody talks very much about the amphibious ships that were around there and the kamikaze attacks that occurred.
Mm.
And so, other little things. So like, my dad's ship landed a battalion of the 6th Marine Division on the beaches of Okinawa, and only 13 of them survived the battle. And one of them was a Medal of Honor winner.
After landing these tanks and the platoon, does the ship disembark or depart from the shore and goes back to the ocean, or a little bit distant from the shore? Or
yeah, the ships at Okinawa, LSTs were designed to go up on the beach, strand themselves. They were flat bottom, so they weren't real stable in heavy seas. And then the bow doors would open and a ramp would come down, and the tanks and stuff would come out. And there was an anchor in the stern that they would deploy about 100 yards out. And once they were done dispensing of the equipment and Marines, they would haul themselves back out to sea and close the ramp and the doors and go back out to sea, and then start doing other things like getting material, more supplies from the cargo ships and bring them into shore, or get more men and bring them into shore. Or they would actually sometimes act as anti-aircraft batteries, so that's what they did.
do they get to dock in a bigger ship, like an aircraft carrier, or do they journey on their own?
They journey on their own. They're independent ships,
so they're somehow large that it can carry several tanks and men, soldier, and they're slow, but they could probably be as tough as a tank, difficult to sink.
Yes, they were over 300 feet long and over 50 foot wide, and they had this big tank deck which stored all the tanks or the landing craft that would go out. When they were also used as sometimes as like hospital ships, where the big tank decks could be used to put wounded soldiers or sailors in. Some of them acted like they could launch small spider planes off them, so they themselves sometimes acted like little aircraft carriers. So, they were very versatile. In fact, they were used up even into the Vietnam War, up the Mekong River.
Wow. And they're flat bottom, so they can just basically go up the shore. Do we still have ships like that in the present, or has it been changed? Like, I know we have aircraft carriers and destroyers, and
the LSTs are the last LST built or launched was in 2002, and you won't find them anymore. They're been replaced by ships they call landing ship docks,
right.
which they stay out in the sea, and the landing craft come and go from them while they're out at sea. So that you don't see them much anymore, but you'll see them in some foreign navies. After the war, the LSTs were sent out to allies. Greece was given some, which LST 325 was gotten from, which you can see at Evansville, Indiana. It's a museum ship you can go on. And it had its own glory. It was at the invasion of Normandy. Right. The Philippines, Taiwan, other Malaysia and stuff like that got LSTs, surplus LSTs, but a lot of them were scrapped after the war too.
I see. So this is a your book is a perfect instrument for readers like myself that would want to know more on trying to paint a picture of World War II and how wars were fought way back then. A perfect instrument, perfect resource for us to know about some war machines that are no longer in service and how this impacted America in those times. So, folks, this is a very good book for historians like or readers that are very much interested to look back and then read stories about World War II. I'm interested. So, Stephen, what are your plans for your book this year?
I guess to hawk the book, I guess, but there's several bookstores around where I live that got signed up to go do book signings for, and some close friends and I've sent books to so they can see. Some of the crewmates that I met are no longer with us because that was in 2003, and there's very few World War II veterans left anymore.
Right.
So, but their families, are still alive, and I think it'd be good for them if they could maybe get the book and see the updates and see what the captain thought during the war and on board the ship and what they were doing.
Where can we pick up your book?
Oh, Amazon has it for sure.
Amazon,
Probably
iuniverse.com, right?
Right. And iuniverse.com has it.
Stephen, as they say, there's a beginning and there's always an end. And so we've come to that part. As an author who has published a book, as someone who's very interested in history, can you please invite your potential readers to get your book and maybe a little advice or final message?
If you're interested in World War II, there's a lot of things that are written about, but they usually don't include some of the things like the LSTs or very much about the LSTs. You can find some videos on the internet about LSTs, but there isn't much about the actual actions of them. If you're interested in that and interested in what those men went through, and learn a little bit about the Coast Guard too, because it was very much active in the war. A lot of people never think of the Coast Guard as a branch, as so to speak, but it is, and it had a lot to play with. And there's actually been some Coast Guard heroes. For example, there was one that actually won the Medal of Honor, so I know of. But other things that they did, like the Coast Guard did beach patrols during the war.
Right, and that's crucial.
Yeah, my father did the first part of the war, did beach patrols in back Virginia. And so I talk a little bit about that and the fact that there was an operation called Pistorius, which the Nazis launched a submarine to put saboteurs onto the beach in the United States that were going to blow up munition factories. And a Coast Guardman picked up on him and told on him, and he was given Distinguished Medal for reporting and stuff. And he was a beach walker.
We wish to read a lot of stuff and learn a lot of stuff about your book, Stephen. And viewers and listeners, you know where to pick it up. It's on Amazon. It's on iuniverse.com. If you're interested to pick up Stephen's book, the title of his book is Pacific LST. Stephen, thank you so much for allowing us to have you in today's episode of the Author Roundup. I hope you enjoyed your time with us.
I did very much. New experience.
Yeah, thank you too. Well, I'm hoping that if you have a sequel of that book, a prequel, or another book that you'll be writing, you'll be publishing, I'm hoping that we'd be able to talk again about that book and catch up and do another episode.
That would be fine. I got a little seed in my idea about some of my experiences as a family doc. So
that's going to be interesting. Stephen, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for our viewers and listeners for staying with us all throughout this conversation. Now, before you go, show some love by subscribing to our channel. Stay tuned for our next interview on the Book Connection Show, where we meet extraordinary indie voices with incredible stories. Again, this is Ray Walters. Join us next time here on the Book Connection Show.